All right. We have a special presentation now of something that I was involved with in 2015, almost exactly 5 years ago on April 22nd. All right. We have a special presentation now of, how to turn the volume there. That was something that I was involved with 5 years ago, on April 22nd, 2015, was an article that I had put out called The Brave Story. It was actually A Brave Story, The King, the Broker, and the One Good Man. That article was something I wrote over a period of 5 days after a show that I had done, a podcast that I had done for Eve News 24. At the time, I didn't know much about Brave. They were kind of like a little brother kicking around. They'd formed Hero Coalition. And I had a guy on the show named Tiberius Stargazer who's heavily involved in Brave. He was the one that kind of reported on what Brave was doing. And so he started to tell me about some of the stuff that was going on and how there was a power struggle and a coup and things were just falling apart. And so we decided to do a show with them, and we invited some of the FCs. We invited Lychton, Travis, a couple others. I forget some names. So we, actually, it was Pork Butt, who had spun off to form Karma Fleet. And it was Travis who'd spun off to form Pandemic Horde. And it was Lychton. And all three of them were on the same show right when it was happening. So we talked to them, and they apologized to each other for some of the stuff they had said, but they were all going their separate ways. And it was an interesting time. So that keyed up my interest, and I started to look into it. And the product of that was a story that I wrote, again, over 5 days. They were frantic days because I felt like this story needed to be told, and somebody was going to tell it. And so I was really staying up. I remember many, many late nights trying to understand what was going on, what was really going on. And it turned out there are many layers to this. There's a layer that EVE Online knew. Then there was the layer that was behind the scenes that involved people's personal lives. And then there was an even deeper layer than that. So it was incredibly interesting story, only part of which could be told because the other parts of it would essentially be doxing people or getting into real life stuff. So the article was written. I wrote it, and I pushed publish because the editor at EN24 at the time. I went to bed. I woke up, and there was just review after review in the comments section about what a great story it was. And for me, it was great. It was the best thing in the world to wake up to a lot of comments, people liking your work. But this was unusually heavy in praise. So CCP contacted me and said, this is a great story, like, wow. So we talked, and I said, I told them I'd be happy to go to Eve Vegas and talk about it. They were happy to give me a time slot. So I went up there and did a presentation to fill in what it's like to write a story like that, what was going on behind the scenes, and that's what the lecture was at Eve Vegas 2015. And so all this was possible because of one person, which is the person that has recently passed away. We know him as Lychton, and he was a big cultural influence for Brave. I can't speak to how important he was to Brave because I'm going to just leave that for them. But as far as EVE Online, looking at it as an observer, as a faux journalist, he was somebody who was not doing things in the typical way. He wasn't getting involved in politics. He wanted to take his group, grow them, move them out into nullsec, but he didn't want to make alliances with anybody particularly. But he did break down and join up with another group at the time that was desperately needing a second act, and that was Hero Coalition. Sorry, it was Test Alliance that was really down and out. And they brought him back because at the time, Brave was a huge group of new players and a ton of excitement and energy. Everybody wanted to be their older brother, basically. And CDOT would, move out, would use supers to kind of clear out Catch and that area so that they could have some space. PL had alts in there and was interested in them. Elise was interested in them. And of course, Goonswarm was looking at them too, trying to help them out with building their facilities, their IT network, and this sort of stuff. So there's all these groups trying to court Lychton and trying to court Brave at that time. So that was kind of the backdrop of the Hero Coalition, which was the first time Test and Brave got together. And so it's interesting because Brave was the big entity in that, and the fledgling little entity was Test. And now it seems to have switched, if I'm not mistaken. They occupy the same space, but Test is now the strong alliance, and Brave is a lot smaller than it used to be. A lot of their members went to Karma Fleet at the time. A lot of their members went to Horde at the time. And ever since, that legacy of new guys can play this game too split into 3 different ways. So, okay, so what I'll do is I'll just play the video. We're going to play it from beginning to end. And then if you guys want to hang out and talk about Brave or talk about this era, it would be cool. This is all in a way of memorializing Lychton and also giving you insight into what his influence was for EVE Online. And we send our condolences to everybody at Brave and everybody who played with Lychton and liked him all over this game. Sorry to see anybody disappear from the cluster. And we salute you in the way that Brave did Lychton. So here's a presentation as it was in Las Vegas 2015. And this was my first presentation at EVE Vegas. So the Illuminati is kind of a boogeyman to just about any culture that you talk about, especially in EVE where there's such a rich environment of secrecy and destruction they can wrought without even showing their face. So I'll talk about that story and take you into that world and then unmask the Illuminati. Well, that's not going to happen, but because they'll probably stop me before I get to the end. First, I'll start with introducing myself. I am Matterall from EVE News 24, and if you haven't heard of EVE News 24, you should go to evenews24.com. Actually, we write news about EVE, and it's a great outfit, great guys there. I want to say hi to Bobman and Tiberius and all the guys that work really hard to bring news. They do it on their own. It's a big volunteer effort. There I work as a writer, editor, podcaster, and sometimes photo editor. Just to keep my chops, I used to work as an art illustrator in my real world. We won't talk about that. I started EVE in 2008. I was looking for a game that wouldn't take up too much time, and I settled on EVE. And there was a slow creep of, well, initially I just wanted to be just a small existence in a bigger world that had things going on, and I could just immerse myself in it and know that there were bigger people taking care of bigger things. But as I got interested in learning how to play the game in a better way, I started reading a lot more, and a lot of that included news and articles, and the dramas that were playing out there were amazing, and so I started to really like the culture outside of EVE as well. And that led me to want to be a part of it, so I decided to try to write. The first story I wrote was called The Tale of Two Parties. And it was, I was fortunate enough to go to Star Trek wrap party in Los Angeles, and right after that, the next week, was the EVE party after E3. And so I took those two and I had a battle report between them, which one was a better party. And I got a really remarkable comment that said, "Hey man, thanks, nice read. I'm just sitting in Starbucks on a cold day in the UK." And I thought, wow, I created something that connected to a guy that was cold in England. And it felt great, because anytime you can create something and feel a connection that somebody else
that reverberated to that person, that's a great feeling. It's a great motivator. So after that, I thought, well, if I get some time, I'll do a little bit more of that. And sure enough, I looked around at where I would end up writing, and Eve News seemed like the most open place. And so I threw my hat in the ring, and that was about a year ago. And since then, I wrote about 80 articles and did 25 podcasts. And we have a podcast. If you haven't listened to it, please do. Am I allowed to shill this much? And the most important thing about all that was the stories that I wanted to write I always wanted to land right after 6 months. If you're in before 6 months, you probably had your hands full. But around that time, you start to really say, what's more? And so between 6 months and 2 years, those are the guys that I wanted to talk to, because that was me, and that's when I needed help. I think that's an interesting time. Well, one of the articles that I wrote was The Brave Story. That was the king, the broker, and the one good man. I liked the way the syllables worked on that, and so I kept the title really long. And it got a good response. I had somebody say it felt like an espionage book, which was a fantastic compliment. And it was a really hard process, a feverish 5 days of collecting information and then putting it out. And I was really tired, and I pushed it out maybe a little early, and I woke up to an email from CCP, and it started out with a lot of expletives, and I thought I was getting banned. I thought that I outed somebody accidentally, and I was done. But no, it was a little bit complimentary, and we started talking, and that's how I ended up here. So the story that The Brave Story covers is really a big space of time where Brave was having a coup and then had a counter coup, and all the pressures that had led up to it, internal and external. And there was one central character that was kind of the mover of unseen parts, and I called him the broker in homage to The Empyrean Age, which is a book I really liked, written for Eve. There was a character in there called the broker who actually started the faction wars. Great book if you haven't read it. And the broker in The Brave Story, the more I investigated him, the more I came across extraordinary power that I wasn't aware of in the game. And this guy possessed it, and he was not alone. He was a type of character, a type of player that actually I came to call the Illuminati, because it's a good vehicle, but also because it seemed a little bit fitting for what the guy could do. So today, that's what we'll talk about, and in the process, hopefully, light up some of the ways that things are investigated as we try to get to the bottom of some stories. But first, we need to start at the very beginning. Does anybody recognize this guy? Okay. 10 years ago, there was a story written for PC Gamer, UK version, I should add, and that was 2005, so 10 years ago. It was called Murder Incorporated. And that story really brought a lot of people to Eve because it was a deliciously RP'd story with a little bit of context. It wasn't long. The story that it described actually didn't affect many people, but at the time it was a juggernaut of a story. It was a contract killing of a rich and powerful CEO, and they had what were called multiple vectors of infiltration into the targeted, they call it the objective, that's who the targeted CEO was. And they had their own Order 66, it was called Nicole, and that password was said through comms. Everything was executed at the same time. A robbery, all their offices, multiple offices. They they betrayed him, assassinated the CEO, and then they thought, we need a Potter for the evidence. We have to have her corpse to deliver to the person who hired us. And this took like 10 months to plan, so it was a big deal. And what it introduced to players was, a lot of players was, wow, first of all, where can you do this? Only in a place like Eve could you do something like that. And it introduced the concept of this meta, and that the meta could actually be a powerful tool in which to influence the game. So you were playing the game, and above the game you're playing what's called the meta. And there are certain powers that people have there. Before this had happened, to give it a little context, a lot of the power was very overt. You had big battleships coming to fight bigger battleships. And a spy really was somebody in their fleet telling you where they were going or what they were doing. And it wasn't that developed. So when this was read, and most of the communications were really just straightforward propaganda. Like you saw earlier today in Andy Gruen's great presentation where Bob responds to like, hey, this is what we got. We got this huge armada. What do you got? And he says, balls. That's what we're bringing. And that was the kind of stuff that was really being played out in the meta or the forums at the time. Well, after the Guiding Hand Social Club, which were the perpetrators of that crime, covert power became very sexy and drew in a lot of people, as I said. Some of the most influential people now in EVE were influenced by that. And those were different kinds of players. They were people who could actually plot out and wait for something to happen. They didn't need the instant gratification. They were there to actually build something over time. And those are a lot of players that actually have stuck around to this day. Because the meta was a signal that you could actually have a ton of power without having to earn it in the game, because you could leverage your human self into the game. If I was a computer programmer, for instance, I could use those skills to build myself third-party software that would help me do things now. And we know that EVE is riddled with that now. So it wasn't a matter of what was in the game keeping you powerful or not powerful, but it was who you were as a person coming in. So let's speed up to 2015, and I'm having a podcast with guests from, I should explain, guests from Brave and from Horde and also from Karma Fleet. And I should explain that those three groups are the newbie-friendly crew that actually get you out into the real action where the combat is and stuff. And those groups grew incredibly fast because at this time, people were eager to get into the big content, the big fight. That's because that's where they were influenced. So where you might have had a spy master generation that came in because they loved the stealth and the manipulation and that sort of stuff, you had after Asakai and the Halloween War and Battle of Head GP and BTAC-R, you had this huge amount of publicity about how big these fights were and how amazingly expensive they were and things that were getting killed. And so that kind of recruitment brought in the kind of people that just wanted that. They wanted to come fight, even if it was an arcade. That's what they were looking for. And so those were the guests that I had, among others. And at the end of that podcast, somebody said to me, and I'll never forget, says, "Have I got a story for you?" And to a writer, that's like saying, well, I don't know, a great many things. So anyway, I had not at this point understood Brave. It was not something that I was keeping track of. We had writers that were actually in Brave doing that. I was focused on the forever war between the old forces of Goons and Bob and their manifestations these days. That's the CFC and N3 at the time. And when he said that here is the thing that you don't know about this, the guy who caused the coup that made Brave collapse into the Western Theater, which would have been right in the middle of where N3 and CFC were fighting, the person who caused that was actually from the CFC. And I thought, well, that's a masterstroke. If you could actually destabilize an alliance fighting in the South, and they fall into the middle of your war, cutting off your opponent, that's an amazing masterstroke. This is like a sign of like the Illuminati being back. So I had to investigate that. That was something that needed to be done. And to tell you a little bit about Brave and the nature of the organization, they were a low-sec group early on, and they really just wanted to fight. Their idea was to get into fights in the game and get out of meta. So they didn't want to play the meta game. They didn't want to take allies. They didn't want diplomacy. They didn't want to do any of that. They just wanted to have fun shooting things and blowing up if they had to. That was what they were about. And that was different. For a long time, there was groups that were actually helping newbies, but people always found ways to criticize them. Like EVE University had the reputation of sheltering newbies and not letting them actually get into the PvP and stuff like that. And Red versus Blue, they had, it was more people who were bored that wanted to fight that were not actually new to the game because it was too hard to actually understand. But these groups were really helpful. All the doctrines were made for them. They were cheap. They were, little skills to get in there. So the whole platform was about them. And they benefited from great timing because at this time there were big fights, as I was saying, people coming in. And actually, CCP released a great trailer called This Is Eve, and that brought in a ton of people to the tune of, they were having hundreds of recruits per week. They were just overflowing with new players that were coming in to check this out. So they had to grow. And in growing, they had to move out of low sec because it just wasn't big enough. So they grew into form a coalition of their own called Hero Coalition. And the Hero Coalition landed in Catch, got a little help, but they were brought in to catch, and they fought Providence, and that was their content for a while. Then when Phoebe hit, they decided to sign a peace treaty and just kind of stabilize because they kind of wanted to wait out the new Sov like everybody else was doing it. PL had other plans for them since they were sitting there. There's so many of them. There's going to be, they're going to go there and play with them. I think veterans always had a strange relationship with Brave, and they wanted to help nurture them, but then they wanted to kill them. And it was kind of like a cat with a moth, if you've ever seen that. He like pounces on him, and then he lets him go, and then he pounces on him, and he lets him go. And I don't know if he eats them or not, but in this case, they didn't. So after a while, a big organization becomes really hard to govern. And so Brave ran into some problems. They had instability, but mostly they had really big holes of security. They had Reddit that was public, which means anybody could comment on it and stir them up. And you had a Jabber that was unsecure, which means that it could be, you could have impersonations on there, and people can grab intel on what's going on and that sort of thing. They use Skype for a lot of stuff, which is prone to grabbing IP addresses off of. And as you know, if you have an IP address of somebody, you can actually do DDoS attacks on them, that sort of stuff. So they were very insecure as an organization, and people did try to help. They sent emissaries to say, let us help you patch things up, but Brave refused because they weren't about the meta. It didn't matter. And I think that was kind of a brilliant strategy, because it's almost like a selfless strategy. If Death wants to come and take everything away that you have, if you have nothing, he has nothing to take. And that's kind of what, whether they knew it or not, what was kind of happening. Like, you can infiltrate us, there's nothing to take. And so in comes this character named Toasty Biggums. He's an old player that turned to Eve. And he's all about the meta. I think he saw House of Cards and was inspired by the workings there, and he thought, Eve was a place that could do that sort of thing, so that's what he was all about. And very quickly he rises to diplomatic power, and I'm talking days. Somebody, an unknown person in an organization inside of a few days is recruiting corporations in, and then a month later he's actually the head of security. It's really amazing how fast his meteoric rise was, and that was suspect right away. And the thing to remember about Brave is it wasn't really a democracy. People make fun of it that it was a democracy and that sort of thing, but it really came down to the CEO's, who was Lychton at the time, his decisions, and sometimes he was hard to get a hold of. So that caused problems because things weren't happening, and they were getting pounded on by PL at the time, so there was a lot of pressure coming in that direction. So eventually, Hero broke up, or Test actually broke away, and one of their spy master before this was Marconius, and he broke away to form Karma Fleet for Goonswarm. Part of the reason he ran to Goonswarm was because they would let him do some of the spy stuff that he wasn't able to do at Brave. And then the FCs for Brave also went to PL. They were unceremoniously kicked out at one point. So they started Pandemic Horde. So those three groups are linked in Brave. That's where they all came from. So the frustrations led to, well, this is actually where I pick up the story. Brave had a coup, and it was done through CEO votes, which is kind of an old way of doing it. See, Brave was so insecure they didn't really plan on this kind of thing happening. They were trusting, I suppose. And so it's very easy to actually remove their president or their CEO from power, but they needed to do a few things before that. But the coup actually unraveled because people were very suspicious of it, and so popular voices started coming in, and they actually rolled it back. And Lychton was about to resign. He was minutes away from going and resigning his post as the CEO of the corporation, Brave, minutes away, before he actually was given back control of everything. And so then at that point, he moved everybody out and took over. And he was restored to power. And so, again, it resonates. Have I got a story for you? That's already a pretty impressive story. But what was interesting about that, and the reason I got involved, was because Brave landed in the Fountain War area, they actually landed right between, well, let me just start by saying NC. Which is the alliance that I am a part of, was going to have a war against the CFC inside a Fountain. And they would only do it if there was two fronts. So they arranged to have a front in the north, a front in the south. BL and NC would fight in the north, and Darkness and NC would fight in the south. And between them, Brave actually landed. So they have thousands of new fighters in that area. Now, they're not necessarily strong, but you're not going to be able to get 3 or 4 guys going back and forth between those two areas, so they're kind of cut off. And that's not why they lost the war, but that was a contributing factor. And so I thought, like, I had to see if this was actually something done on purpose or if it was an accident. So I did a ton of interviews, including trying to get in touch with Toasty himself to ask him, like, are you from the CFC? But he didn't answer any calls. So I had to actually do research on my own to try to figure out who this guy was. And the first place I went is to Eve Who, which evewho.com, you probably know it. If you don't, it's a great site. You can see where people come and go from corporations. It's kind of limited, but it does that. So that's a good place to actually check if a timeline of somebody's experience. And I noticed in there right away that he was in Sniggeredly and he was in Tropa de Elite, and both those are PL Corps. So I was going this way, and then I ended up going this way. He's now in PL. And there was another corp he was involved with called Dead Zone. Does anyone know who Dead Zone is? Well, Dead Zone's a very specific corp. It only has 15 members ever. And that corp was used to lock Solar Fleet into what's called a dead zone. And that was the first time it was ever done. PL created a corporation that owned that news station, and they didn't trust anybody, even PL guys. So only 2 guys or 3 guys had the keys to that, and all the assets for Solar were supposed to be stuck in there. And that was called the first dead zoning. It was, Nully was dead zoned by the Goon Swarm a little bit later after the Halloween War, and that was the second time it happened. So that already was a choke point for where this guy came from. So I went to Dotland to see what alliances were in there, and I realized there was only 2 corporations. Sorry, what corporations were in that alliance? There was only 2, so I started investigating the characters there. And you can go to their kill board to try to figure out their behavior. You can see, like, if he's flying a recon and it has a Sino on it, it's probably an alt that he uses for a super attack, where you hook the bait and then you drop your super and you score. So that kind of stuff shows you, like, where the person's coming from. But I quickly figured out that his behavior changed and there was a point where that thing was happening, so I knew this character was sold. So when a character is sold, you can go to Character Bazaar in the EVE Online forums, and by law, every transfer of character has to be logged in there. So you would look it up. And thanks to Crib, I think we could do EVE search. We looked up who he was. And unfortunately, sometimes that yields results. But whoever did this was clever, and they used triple burned alts to do the trading of this character. So it was impossible to go past that. And that's when you buy an alt, and with that alt you buy another alt, and with that alt you buy a third alt, and then you buy what you want. And by the time you trace back, it goes nowhere. Because if somebody buys, even with an alt that they don't use, if that person is used to comment in certain forums, you can try to map the behavior of the comments in the forums. You can map what they were trying to sell. Or you can map here and see if another alt say kind of the same thing around the same time. Because sometimes people make comments with 2 alts on the same topic to get a little more, to be heard a bit better. But that didn't happen. All these alts were dead. Nothing was going on with them. So I had to be a little more aggressive. And I went back to Toasty, and I sent him one last email. And I was under the gun because a lot of this stuff was starting to come out, and I really wanted to be first. So I sent him an email saying I knew something that he would want to know. And that got me an answer. And the first thing he said was, "You know nothing." I felt like Jon Snow. I was like, okay. He says, okay, you have 10 minutes, and then I'm gone. And so to ask him anything at that point, he would have just shut it down. So what I decided to do was to say, hey, this amazing thing happened. I know you're a part of it. Tell me just if you can fill in these details for me. And in doing that, I invited him to contribute to what we were doing. And I think that worked because he started talking. And he came on to 5, okay. It's all right, I'll rush through these. It turned out he was not working for the Goons, that he was somebody that actually was just buying a holding alt. He put it in Brave. He liked Brave, so the meta strategy was working. And he actually just started playing with Brave and enjoyed it. So really his motivating factor was not to destroy Brave on behalf of anybody else, but was to fix it because he felt like it wasn't going well. They had made some maneuvers. There was something that was going to be called the Clown Car Coalition, which would have BL, Nully, Russians, including Solar, with Brave, ruling the North and just kind of roaming around and destroying things. And that fell through because Pro-God Legend, who was head of Nully at the time, was not interested in working with Russians. But that never got reported back to the guys that had put it together, and he was one of those guys. So that kind of frustration of doing something that's exciting and not having it go anywhere built up, and they decided to do the coup in order to restore Brave to a more workable situation for them. So I wrote this thing, and I had to use archetypes of the king and chancellors and a court and stuff, just so people could digest that much information. So it was written kind of like a fairy tale. And I did many rewrites of it because they had to be done. So at the very end, I tacked on a big finish, which was the investigation of who he was, this broker, and what he did. And he had a really interesting line of things that he did. He was kind of merciless. He was amazing and merciless. In other words, he was actually cooperating with the FCs because he wanted to do this coalition. And that wasn't going anywhere, so they had this vent together where they were just venting at each other. And because their plans were different, the FCs wanted to keep Lychton, but Toasty actually thought that Lychton had to go. So what he decided to do was doctor the log, turn it into Lychton, and get them expelled. And in that, he got a better position as head of security. And so he was burned his allies. And they still liked him. That's how charismatic he was. But he was also the corp recruiter, so he brought those guys in, and with all that power, he's able to leverage the vote. He lied to CEOs of other corporations saying, Brave is splitting up, and only you can save it if you vote to get him out, because that's the way it's going, and that was not true. And they also used holding corps, which they told everybody else they weren't doing. So he actually did maneuver to get this thing actually done and Lychton out. And it just wants you to remember, and I'll wrap it up right here, Toasty was just one guy, and he's not alone. There are other guys like him. He's friends with a ton of guys that are actually like him. And who are these guys, these Illuminatis? Well, I can't tell you their real names, although it's incredibly interesting who they are and what they do. But I do know that they're very tech-heavy security experts. And those are the guys that work with diplomatic corps to penetrate, either through spy games or that sort of stuff, or to seal up and defend. And so there is the game we play, there is the meta, and above the meta is a meta of the meta. The people who are controlling the information that gets put into the information that helps us play the game. And the kind of stuff they do are, well, with a full API, if you plug it into a program called Eve API, you can actually map out people's email plus their standings, and you can get a whole social picture of what they look like. This is used by corporations to figure out if you're a spy or not. But more than that, there's if they get your IP, they can actually put a link inside of local. If you click the link, they can capture your IP address. With an IP address, they can use a DDoS attack to turn you off in the middle of your Titan battle. Stuff like that. Now, that's not necessarily ethical, and I don't even know if it's legal in the game, but that's the kind of thing they can do. And in defense of that, inside the inside the game browser has headers that you can actually maneuver. So you can say that you're this person in their corporation, and when you click that link, it reports that person's name with your IP address, a known spy's IP address, and they get thrown out of their corp. There's also stuff where they impersonate people by going into a Jabber channel, listing their nickname as the same person who's already in there, and it doesn't show the person twice, it shows the person once. So you're actually invisible. And then you can recover everything that's been said inside those channels. So the point is, these guys do have powers, they do exist, they do play the game at a very high level. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to be afraid of them, but I will leave you with this. In the aftermath of stealing, and this is the Guiding Hand Social Club, the first story I told you about, in the aftermath, he was asked, don't you feel bad for all the corp mates that had nothing to do with the CEO? And he said, no, we don't believe the corp members sustained any unrecoverable damage, save for, perhaps, their sense of security. Thank you.
All right. Sorry, the ending came up on me. So I want to say thanks for listening to that. And we want to remember that we lost a great player from EVE Online. His name was Lychton. He was head of Brave. He kind of took them from, he wasn't the founder, but he was one of the early members who took them into a different stratosphere. And since then, it really, a lot of things pivoted on some of the decisions that he made. So that was a lecture that I did on how interesting Brave was in their turmoil. And he was a big part of that and all the stuff that followed after that. So thanks very much for listening to that special broadcast. I want to remind you to tune in to CCP later today in about 1 hour when they go through and talk about EVE music and some of the soundtrack of EVE Online. And that's really important for players who've been around for 15 years or more. All the music they've been listening to this whole time. It's a good celebration of that. So check that out on CCP's channel. Thanks very much for watching. And if you want to see that video, you can see that on CCP's YouTube. I'll give you a link just so you can, here is a link to the actual article that I wrote. We'll probably revisit that article soon. Here is a link to CCP for later today. And then finally, what I want to get you is a link to that lecture that you just saw. I've done like 3 or 4 of them so far. This was the first one, so I was a bit nervous. I'd come on right after Null Arbor had talked about the... right after he talked about Citadels. So they just made all the Citadel announcements, and I was sitting there with a huge crowd trying to get through this material. As you check that out there. Once again, thanks guys for tuning in today for Talking in Stations and this special rebroadcast of the Brave story in memorial of Lychton. And we will see you on Monday for some more Today in EVE Online. Take care, everyone.